Said I wasn't allowed at my grandson's birthday party unless I apologized. I transferred every dollar I'd ever lent them out of their joint account that same morning. Let me tell you how it started. Not with a fight, not with anything loud. It started with a folding chair. My son's wife, I'll call her by what she preferred I call her, which was nothing really, because she never quite settled on a name for what I was supposed to be, had arranged the backyard for Theo's 5th birthday. Streamers, a rented bounce house, little paper plates with cartoon dinosaurs. I'd driven 40 minutes to help set up. I brought the cake. I'd spent 2 days baking it, cream cheese frosting, the kind Theo asked for, specifically because he'd had a slice at my kitchen table in January and hadn't stopped talking about it since. I set the cake on the folding table near the fence and turned to ask where my son wanted the extra chairs. That's when my daughter-in-law looked at me the way you look at a package left on your porch that you didn't order. "We actually have it handled," she said. "You don't need to stay for setup." I stood there with a folding chair still in my hands. I brought the cake. "I see that." She smiled the way she always smiled when she was ending something. "We'll take it from here." My son was on the other side of the yard inflating a balloon. He heard every word. He kept inflating. I put the chair down. I said I'd be back in time for the party. She said, "Actually, we were hoping to keep it small this year, just our immediate family." I looked at her. Then I looked at my son, who had finally turned around and was now studying the balloon like it held the answers to every hard question he'd ever avoided. "I'm his grandmother," I said. "We know," she said. "We'll send pictures." I drove home. Not crying. Not yet. Just that particular kind of quiet that fills a car when something inside you breaks cleanly, without mess, the way old wood splits along a grain it's been waiting to follow for years. My name is Neva. I'm 67 years old. I was a librarian for 31 years in a small town in central Ohio, and I raised 2 children in a yellow house on a street with oak trees older than anyone in the neighborhood, my husband Gerald. I still catch myself reaching for that name like it's in my pocket. Died 4 years ago from a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March. He was making eggs. He sat down on the kitchen floor and didn't get up. I tell you that because everything after Gerald is a different story. And my son, let's call him my son because that's what he is, whatever else he may have become, was good to me in the beginning. Tender, even. He came over on weekends. He helped me clear the garage. He called on the anniversary of Gerald's death, the 1st year and the 2nd, and I think the 3rd, though I'm less sure about that one now. Then he married Simone. I want to be fair. Simone is not a villain in the way people expect villains to look. She doesn't shout. She doesn't insult. What she does is manage. She manages my son the way you manage a budget, carefully, with a clear sense of what can be trimmed. And somewhere in the first 2 years of their marriage, I became a line item she had decided wasn't necessary. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way a tide comes in, quietly, until one day you look down and realize the sand under your feet has been gone for a long time. She started with small things. The holiday dinners shifted to her parents' house, then became just us, years. Then became something I received photos of the next morning. My opinion on Theo's schooling was politely absorbed and never referenced again. When I offered to watch him while they traveled for their anniversary, she said they'd found someone, a neighbor, someone structured, she said, which I gathered meant someone who wasn't me. I brought cookies to their house one Sunday in November, and she thanked me and set them on the counter, and I watched them sit there, untouched, for the 40 minutes I stayed. When I left, she was already moving them toward the trash. My son said she meant well. That was his entire response to everything I ever told him. She means well. I started keeping a note on my phone. Not intentionally. Not as evidence. Just because I needed somewhere to put things. The time she interrupted me mid-sentence to check a text and never asked me to finish. The time she told Theo, within earshot, that Grandma had old-fashioned ideas about nutrition, after I brought him an orange. The time she redecorated the guest room, the one I used to sleep in when I visited, into a home office, and didn't mention it until I arrived with my overnight bag. I slept on the pull-out sofa that visit. My son carried my bag down the stairs with the particular silence of a man who knows he's done something wrong but has decided it's easier to carry the bag than answer for the room. None of that was why I did what I did. What I did because of the birthday party and because of the money. And because I finally understood that the money and the birthday party were the same thing. 2 years after Gerald died, my son called me with what he described as an opportunity. He and Simone wanted to open a business, a small landscaping company. He'd always been good with plants, that was true. He'd learned it from his father. They needed startup capital. Banks were slow. Would I consider a short-term loan? I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. We drafted something loose on paper. The kind of agreement that only works between people who trust each other. $30,000, 12% annual interest. He'd pay it back within 3 years. That was 6 years ago. He paid back $11,000 over the first 2 years. Then the payment stopped. When I brought it up, my son said the business had hit a rough patch. When I brought it up again, 6 months later, Simone was suddenly in the room, and the conversation had become something else. Something about stress and pressure, and how I had to understand how hard they were working. I understood. I stopped bringing it up. But I didn't stop keeping track. The morning after the birthday party, after the folding chair and the cream cheese cake and my son's balloon, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Long enough that the coffee went cold and I didn't notice. Long enough that the light changed in the room from morning pale to the full flat brightness of 10 o'clock. I'd been quiet for a long time. I'd been small for a long time. I'd told myself it was patience, told myself it was love, told myself that a mother who asks for nothing gets to keep everything that matters. But sitting at that table, I realized I hadn't kept anything. I'd just been slowly handed back to myself, piece by piece, like returned mail. I picked up my phone and called my accountant. Then I called my lawyer. His name is Philip Marsh, and he's been handling my affairs since Gerald and I bought this house 30 years ago. When I told him what I needed, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'll have something ready by Friday." I said I needed it by Thursday. He said he'd try. Then I called my financial advisor, a steady woman named Connie who speaks in the flat, reassuring tones of someone who has seen every version of family catastrophe, and none of it surprises her anymore. I told her about the loan agreement. I told her I had documentation, bank transfers, the paper we'd signed, the partial repayments. I told her I wanted to initiate a formal collection process. She said, "Neva, are you sure?" I said, "I've been sure since about 9 o'clock yesterday morning. Now, I need to explain something about the money because this is where it gets complicated in a way that matters." The $30,000 I'd lent my son hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from a savings account Gerald and I had built together over 40 years of careful living. A little less vacation every summer. A little less new every season. Gerald called it the buffer. He meant it as a cushion for whatever came next. New roof, new car, unexpected medical bills, the kinds of quiet disasters that middle-class families absorb without anyone noticing. After Gerald died, I'd split the buffer in my mind between 3 things: my own security, what I'd leave for my son someday, and what I'd leave for Theo. The loan had come from that last portion. The portion I'd earmarked for my grandson. When my son failed to repay it, he hadn't just borrowed money from his mother. He'd spent his own son's inheritance and then sent me pictures instead of inviting me to the boy's birthday party. I don't think he'd thought about it that way, but I had. Philip came through by Thursday afternoon. A formal demand letter. Legally sound. Repayment of the outstanding balance, $19,000, plus interest as per the original agreement, within 30 days. I read it twice, signed it, and mailed it certified. Then I called my daughter, who lives in Portland and has a kind of quiet sanity I have always been grateful for. Her name is Petra, and she answered on the second ring, the way she always does when she sees it's me. I did something, I told her. She said, "Tell me." I told her everything. The party, the cake, the chair, the letter. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill she inherited from Gerald, and I've always envied. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." Just that. Good. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to say it. The next few days were quiet. I cleaned out the front flower bed and planted the tulip bulbs I'd been putting off since October. I called the library where I used to work and asked if they still needed volunteers for story hour. They did. I went on a Thursday and read to 11 four-year-olds who couldn't have cared less about my family drama, which was exactly the medicine I needed. On the 9th day, my son called. I let it ring. I let the next one ring too. On the third call, I picked up because I was tired of hearing my own ringtone. Mom. His voice had that particular quality, not angry, not quite. Tight. Like something had gotten hold of it. "What is this letter?" "It's a demand letter," I said. "Philip Marsh's office sent it. You should have all the information you need. You hired a lawyer on me." "I retained the lawyer who handles all of my affairs, yes." He drew up the letter. There was a pause. I could hear him breathing. "I can't believe you do this." I set down the dish towel I'd been holding. "You sent me pictures of your son's birthday party." He started to say something about stress and timing and how hard things had been. I listened. I had heard this particular arrangement of words before, in varying orders, and I knew how it ended. It ended with me saying I understood, me saying take your time, me finding a way to make his failure my accommodation. "I need you to hear me," I said. And I said it quietly, the way I used to say it when he was young, and I needed him to stop and actually listen. "I'm not angry. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because for 6 years I have been asked to make myself smaller and smaller, and I finally ran out of room." Silence. "The letter stands," I said. "If you want to talk about a repayment schedule, I'm open to that. Philip can work with your attorney. But the conversation is done." I hung up. I sat down. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be. 2 days later, Simone called. I don't know what I expected. Not an apology, not really, but I hadn't expected what I got, which was a calm, organized presentation of grievances. She said I'd been passive-aggressive for years. She said the letter was hostile and calculated. She said I was trying to destabilize their family. I thought about all the cookie plates left untouched. The pull-out sofa. The folding chair I never got to use. "Simone," I said, "I know you believe everything you just said. I don't think it would help either of us for me to tell you why I disagree, but I want you to know that none of this is about you. It's about me deciding, a little late in the day, that I matter." She said something after that. I don't remember what it was. I had already decided I didn't need to. The one who surprised me was Theo. He's 5. He doesn't understand money or letters or the geography of adult grievance. But 2 weeks after the party, his mother apparently told him I wasn't going to be coming over for a while, and he somehow got hold of her phone and called my number. I picked up to hear breathing, then, "Grandma, are you mad at me?" That was the only time I cried. Standing in my kitchen, holding the phone, talking to a 5-year-old who didn't know why the adults in his life had made a mess of things. "I'm not mad at you," I said. "Not even a little. I love you like breathing." He thought about that for a second. "Like breathing? It means I can't stop." He seemed satisfied with that. He asked if I would make the cream cheesecake again sometime. I said absolutely. He said okay and handed the phone back to his mother. She didn't say anything. I didn't either. We just both hung up, which is maybe the most honest conversation we'd had in years. Petra came to visit the following month. She stayed for a week, and we painted the living room a color we couldn't agree on until we were standing in the hardware store and both reached for the same sample chip at the same moment. Dusty sage. Gerald would have hated it, which we agreed was part of the charm. We didn't talk about my son every day. Some days we talked about her work, her garden, the neighbor she'd been cautiously interested in for 8 months and hadn't yet acted on. We watched old movies. We went to the farmer's market and I bought too much rosemary, and she bought a jar of honey with a hand-painted label, and neither of us needed those things and we didn't care. On her last evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and asked what I was going to do with the money if I recovered it. I'd already thought about it. "There's a savings account I want to open," I said. "For Theo. Long-term, protected. Something nobody can borrow from." She looked at me over the rim of her glass. "That's very you. He asked about the cake," I said. "He's 5 and he asked about the cake. That kid has done nothing wrong and I don't want him growing up without something to stand on." Petra was quiet for a moment. "And the rest? For yourself?" I looked at the walls, the dusty sage that I now liked more than I expected to. "I want to take a trip," I said. "I haven't been anywhere since Gerald. I want to go somewhere he and I always talked about and just go. Alone. With a book and sensible shoes and absolutely no agenda." "Where?" "Vermont," I said. "In October, when the leaves are doing what they do." She smiled. "He would have loved that." "I know. That's the point." The demand letter worked out eventually. Not all at once, not without negotiation, and not without a particularly uncomfortable phone call between Philip and my son's attorney, in which, from what Philip told me, my son discovered for the first time the full accounting of what he owed, including interest. There was apparently a silence on the line that lasted long enough to become its own kind of sentence. A repayment schedule was agreed upon. Structured. Monthly installments. A formal agreement this time. Not loose paper between people who trust each other, because I had finally accepted that trust and legal documentation are not the same thing, and that loving someone doesn't mean you have to be unprepared. My son sent me a text 2 weeks after the paperwork was signed. It said, "I know you're angry. I'm sorry things got to this point." I read it several times. I noticed what it didn't say. It didn't say, "I'm sorry for the birthday party." It didn't say, "I'm sorry for not speaking up when I should have." It said, "I'm sorry things got to this point," which is the kind of apology that makes the situation responsible for itself. I typed back, "I'm not angry. Take care of yourself." That was true. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had been useful for a while, the way a fire is useful. It burns what needs to go. But I wasn't interested in living in the ash. What I was by then was clear. Clear about what I would lend and what I wouldn't. Clear about what I would accept and what I would name out loud instead of swallowing. Clear that being 67 years old in a yellow house with a dusty sage living room and too much rosemary in the fridge was not the diminished thing I had been made to feel it was. It was, in fact, a life. A real one. I went to Vermont in October, rented a small cabin near Stowe. Drove up through the kind of morning that makes you understand why people have always made up stories about gods living in the sky. The maples were doing exactly what they do, going gold and red and impossible. And I drove with the window down even though it was cold, because Gerald always said that cold air through a window in autumn was one of the few free things left in the world worth having. I hiked the same trail 3 days in a row because the third time I finally stopped worrying about whether I was doing it right and just walked. I ate dinner alone each night and read the same novel I'd been carrying in my bag for 2 years without opening. I opened it. I didn't call my son. He didn't call me. I called Dio on his half-birthday because that's a thing I started doing when he was 3. Calling on the 6-month mark because 5-year-olds live in a time so immediate that 6 months might as well be another life. He answered with both hands apparently full of crackers and told me he'd learned to ride his bike without training wheels, which he demonstrated by narrating the whole thing at high speed while presumably still eating crackers. "Grandma," he said at the end, "when are you making the cake again?" "At Christmas," I said. "If you want." He said he wanted. I said I'd be there. I meant it the way you mean things when you finally stopped wondering whether you're allowed to. The last night in Vermont, I sat on the cabin porch with a cup of chamomile and watched the stars in a way I hadn't watched stars since Gerald. Since the two of us used to sit outside late when the kids were asleep and the neighborhood was quiet, and we both understood without saying it that we were lucky, that this ordinary life was the remarkable thing, and we just hadn't been told that yet. I'm not sure I'll ever stop missing him. I think that's fine. Missing someone you loved completely is just love, with nowhere new to go, and there are worse things to carry. But I wasn't carrying anything that night. Not the folding chair, not the untouched cookies, not the 6 years of making myself small enough to fit inside somebody else's idea of who I should be. I wrote in the journal I'd bought at the airport, on the last blank page, "I am nobody's inconvenience." I closed it, finished my tea, listened to the wind in the trees that were still holding a few last leaves, all of them the color of something burning clean. That's how it ends. Not with a door slamming, not with a scene. Just a woman on a porch in October, at the beginning of whatever comes next, not waiting for permission to begin. If you've ever been handed a folding chair in a room you helped build, this one's for you. Leave a comment. Tell someone. The silence has already lasted long enough. I've thought a lot about what made me finally act. Not the birthday party, though that was the moment. Not the cake left on the table. Not the folding chair I never got to sit in. Those were just the last of a very long series of small things, and small things only feel small until you've collected enough of them to understand what they actually are. What they are is a pattern. And patterns, once you can see them clearly, are hard to unsee. For a long time I told myself that patience was the same as wisdom, that keeping quiet to preserve the peace was a sign of maturity, that a woman my age should know better than to make things difficult. I believed that if I made myself easy enough to have around, eventually the people I loved would choose to have me around. That's not wisdom. That's a transaction where only one side is paying. The hard truth I had to sit with, and I mean really sit with, at my kitchen table at 10 in the morning with cold coffee and no one watching, is that I had made it very easy for my son to take things from me. Not because he was cruel by nature, but because I had never once made the cost visible. I absorbed everything quietly and called it love. And I think, somewhere along the way, he stopped being able to tell the difference between what I gave freely and what I gave because I had run out of ways to say no. That's not entirely his fault. It's not entirely his fault. It's not entirely mine either. It's just what happens when two people spend years pretending a problem doesn't exist because naming it would require something neither of them is ready to do. What I know now is this. There is a version of kindness that serves everyone, and there is a version that serves no one, least of all yourself. The first kind comes from a place that's full. The second comes from a place that's been emptied out slowly, so slowly you didn't feel it going. I'd been running on the second kind for years, giving from empty, wondering why I felt invisible. When I sent that demand letter, I wasn't punishing my son. I was simply making visible something that had always been true, that what I gave had value, that I had value, and that the two were connected. You cannot spend 40 years building a life, raising children, holding a family together through grief and loss and ordinary Tuesday morning disaster, and then accept that your presence at a 5-year-old's birthday party is conditional. You cannot do that and call it peace. It isn't peace. It's surrender dressed up to look like it. What I found on the other side of that decision was not victory. It wasn't the satisfaction I might have imagined. It was something quieter and more durable. A sense of being aligned with myself again, like I'd finally stopped walking at an angle to accommodate someone else's comfort and just walk straight. Theo asked me about the cake. That's what I keep coming back to. A 5-year-old, in the middle of everything the adults had made complicated, asked about the cream cheese cake, because to him, I was still just his grandmother. The person who made the thing he liked. The person who said she loved him like breathing. None of the rest of it had touched him yet. And I wanted, more than almost anything, to make sure it never did. So I opened the trust. I made something that would still be standing when he was old enough to need it, no matter what the adults decided to do with their grievances in the meantime. That felt like the right use of everything I'd been carrying. Take care of what you've built, name what you're owed, and if someone tells you that you're not welcome somewhere you helped make, believe them. Thank them for the clarity, and go build something better with your hands still free.